So in this video, I will offer you some tips and tricks to help you find story ideas for your news items, for your news stories. The photo in the background is a photo I took a few years ago during a rally on Parliament Hill. The rally was organized by farmers who were in favor of supply management. So that's a very good example of a current event. So current events such as protest, rallies, natural disasters, fires, motor vehicle accidents, and so on are events that are generally covered by journalists because they have consequences for citizens and or are current events which cater to the public interest. You can also do follow-up stories. A follow-up story, as the name implies, is a story stemming from another one, whether it was your own story or someone else's story. So say today I were to cover a deadly fire, that would be my current event, or a breaking news event, and then tomorrow I could decide to focus on the aftermath. That would be a follow-up story. News conferences, press secretaries, news releases are also very good sources when it comes to finding story ideas. So you might be invited to a news conference to announce a new project, or a press secretary might get in touch with you, or you might get a press release. A word of caution though, and I am not implying here that anyone is acting in bad faith, but you have to exercise your better judgment when contacted by press secretaries or PR folks. They have a job to do, which is to convey a message for their client, and your job as a reporter is to decide what's interesting to your readers, what's in the public interest, and quite frankly, you might receive dozens of press releases every day, dozens of invitations. So it is your job to create the best stories for your audience. Interest and advocacy groups, community groups, special interest groups are also very good sources. Sometimes they will get in touch with you, or you might now and then, give a call to some of your sources in those groups, and they might have a story to suggest to you. And again, it is your job to decide whether or not you want to pursue the story, but it doesn't cost you anything to call people up and ask. You can also do a story stemming from scientific studies, from surveys. When, doing a story based on a scientific study, you need to be careful not to oversimplify it. You still need to maintain some nuances. And I'd say that scientific journalism is a form of journalism in its own right. You can also use surveys, whether it is a survey that was commissioned by a third party or by your own media organization. You may want to do a story based on the survey. But again, there are rules in place and you need to be careful. You need to check the sample, you need to check the methodology, and so on, the margin of error. So don't take a survey for granted, but surveys are useful sources. Other news outlets or wire services, such as the Canadian Press, will publish stories, and they can be a great source of inspiration. And when it comes to wire services, depending on the license or the contract between your news organization and the wire service, you might be able to reuse an article verbatim, or you might have to repackage the article. So if you take CBC Radio Canada, for example, the contract with the Canadian Press allows CBC Radio Canada reporters to republish a CP story verbatim while crediting the Canadian Press. But it is also permitted to use the Canadian Press as a source within a much longer article written by CBC Radio Canada employees. Social media can also be a good place to look for stories. But be careful, social media can easily become an echo chamber. So you will think that something is very relevant, that something major is happening, and sometimes it is the case. And sometimes it is, as we say in French, a perfect storm in a glass of water, right? Tempête dans un verre d'eau. So it's nothing major, it's nothing to worry about, it's not necessarily relevant, but because it is happening on social media, we are under this impression that, everyone is aware of the situation. So be careful, be cautious, yet social media platforms can be great sources when it comes to finding story ideas, and we will talk some more about that in the coming weeks. Here are other sources that you may turn to find story ideas, so you can receive tips from the public, and sometimes members of the public will contact you or contact your newsroom directly, and sometimes you might put out a call asking the public to send you information regarding an event, or you might ask for witnesses. The same goes for sources. Sometimes, regular sources of yours might contact you with a story idea, or you may want to follow up with some of your sources now and then to see whether or not they have something for you. Agendas and minutes from public and parapublic organizations, so school boards, the local universities, the local hospitals, city council, and so on. Some parapublic organizations also have to hold public meetings, so you can think of transit agencies and similar organizations. So by looking at the agenda for an upcoming meeting, you might be able to come up with a story idea, so you could do an advanced piece, or by looking at the minutes from a previous meeting, you might discover that you missed a major story, or at the very least, an interesting story. You can, of course, attend a meeting held by public and parapublic organizations. You can take a look on websites where you can find public tenders. So whenever a public entity wants to make a purchase, whether it is for goods or services, generally this organization will have to put out a tender. Obviously, there are rules when it comes to buying, a stack of paper and stuff like that. But generally, any contract will have to go through a tendering process. Anniversaries, such as 10 years later, a year later, 6 months later, are also very good story ideas. You could file an access to information request in order to find information about a particular issue. Obviously, that is not a sure shot. You will need to file your request and see what comes out of it. And lastly, you could sign up for newsletters and listservs, and you will receive newsletters and emails from a variety of organizations, and now and then you can take a look at the emails you've been receiving, and you might find a story idea, or at the very least, it will help you stay up to date regarding certain issues. And your own observations are also very valuable. So you may witness a situation, say last summer, I took the O train to go to work and noticed that some OC Transpo drivers and employees were still not wearing a mask. So we followed up with OC Transpo and ended up doing a story. And I filmed some footage with my cell phone that was akin to using a hidden camera. So there are rules, and you can't just do it on your own. Be careful. But in that case, I had some footage as well. So OC Transpo couldn't deny the issue. Let's now look at a few examples. This photo I took a few years ago when, I think it was in 2017. So when Highway 50 was flooded during the 2017 floods, and I think that was a call that we had received, and then I was sent there by an assignment editor with a camera, which can take photos and also allow you to film footage. So I took a few photos for the website and shot a short piece for TV. Here's a good example of a follow-up story. So I was filling in on the CBC side for a few weeks in the summer of 2019. There had been floods in the Ottawa-Gatineau area in the spring, and I decided to make a few phone calls, and I discovered that the Erdley-Masham Road, which had to be closed back in April of that year, I think, had yet to reopen. And some business people were worried because this is a shortcut which goes through Gatineau Park, but it is managed by the province, not by the National Capital Commission, although it goes through Gatineau Park. And for instance, there was this man who had just purchased a restaurant at the entrance of the road. So he was a bit worried because he said that drive-by traffic had gone down following the closure of that road. So that's a follow-up story. Here's another one. And by the way, there are about 10 stories in the PowerPoint slides. I will put the slides on the course website so you can download them. And the screen grabs are actually attached to a link. So if you click on Control and then the left side of your mouse, you will be able to load these articles and read them. So that's another example. Monument aux victimes du communisme, le financement privé bat de l'aile. For this particular story, I had filed an access to information request with Canadian Heritage. So the Communism Memorial downtown Ottawa was a very politicized issue leading up to the 2015 federal election. And I wanted to learn a little bit more about the relationship between Tribute to Liberty, which was the organization sponsoring the project, and Canadian Heritage. So I asked Canadian Heritage for emails dating back about a year, which were sent either by Canadian Heritage to Tribute to Liberty or by Tribute to Liberty to Canadian Heritage. And I received about 100 pages of emails, and I discovered one particular email in which someone from Canadian Heritage was summarizing a meeting with Tribute to Liberty and saying, well, if I understood correctly, you won't be meeting your fundraising targets. And I dig deeper and ended up with this story. My CBC colleague, Amanda Pfeffer, worked with me as well and did an English language version. Haitian diaspora tries to stay hopeful 10 years after the devastating quake. That's a follow-up story, which is also a 10 years later story. So I attended Sunday service at a downtown Ottawa church, which is a church where members of the Haitian diaspora congregate every weekend. And I talked to a few people, including Fanoun Mallette, who was in Haiti, and she was pregnant in 2010, and then moved to Canada with her son, her daughter, and her husband. And she agreed to give me an interview. So if you actually visit the CBC story online, you will see a photo of Fanoun Mallette and her family. I think it's actually her in the foreground. So read the story if you're interested, and that's a good example of a 10 years later story. You could do a year later, 3 months later, 25 years later, and the key is to try to find something new, right? The mere fact that the quake happened 10 years ago was interesting, but I needed something more. So by talking to people, I ended up leading with Fanoun's story and how she came to Canada and how she's worried for her fellow Haitians back home. Le système de paye Phoenix, le gouvernement cherche encore à améliorer la formation de ses employés. So this is an example of a story stemming from a public tender website. So the federal government operates a website called buyandsell.gc.ca. And on this website, you can find a variety of documents, including public tenders and call for requests for offers or requests for information. So the federal government had put out a request for information and ideas from the private sector to fix Phoenix. So in this particular case, the story was easy enough to find. I simply spent a few hours exploring buyandSell.gc.ca and found some relevant documents, made a few calls, sent a few emails, and ended up with this story. A very similar story. Well, the story isn't similar at all, but the approach is very similar. So, De nouveaux travaux en vue au Musée canadien de la nature d'Ottawa. That's a story I did in 2015, and it wasn't an exclusive story. Anyone else could have done it, but I discovered on, again, buyandSell.gc.ca, a tender because the Canadian Museum of Nature wanted to undergo a major transformation. So I found the tender. I emailed the PR officer for the museum. He told me, look, we weren't ready to make an announcement yet, but since you found the information and contacted me, I'll give you an interview. And that's how I got the story. Was a little scoop, nothing major, but it's always nice when you learn something before everyone else. Homeowners want province to help flood-proof, not just rebuild. This is a very good example of, a rather mundane event. It was an information session for homeowners in the Constance Bay area of Ottawa, so west end of Ottawa, and that was in July 2019. Homes had been flooded in April and May of that year. The Municipal Affairs and Housing Ministry held this meeting for homeowners to tell them how they could ask the provincial government for money to reimburse repair costs and so on. And, I could have done the story straight up about the meeting, but why would it be relevant to someone, say, in Orleans or downtown Ottawa? It would have done the trick. But again, my goal, alongside my assignment editor, was to find something a little bit more interesting. So I attended the meeting, talked to a few people, and I listened. I just sat there and listened. And I noticed that several homeowners were asking the two representatives from the Ontario Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing to not only get money to make some repairs to their home, but they were asking whether they could get money to flood-proof their property. It sounds logical, but that's not how the program was built. So I did a story about it because they were saying, well, I might as well, I don't know, waterproof the foundation of my basement instead of simply rebuilding my basement because, if next year we get flooded again, I will have to start all over again. So that's a good example of a mundane meeting that you might have to attend as a reporter. And it's a good example of how you can find a more interesting story by simply listening and talking to people. That's one of my favorite stories. It's rather basic, but it was kind of funny to just stand at the corner of Saint Laurent and Donald. That's actually 30 seconds away from my house. And that's how I got the story. I was coming back from work and noticed all of these cars, and they are actually in a bike lane. So a few years back, the city of Ottawa redesigned the intersection to make it safer for cyclists and pedestrians by creating this segregated zone. But it's not painted. And up to that point, there weren't any signs. The only real indication that this wasn't a slip lane, but a bike lane, was that it was narrower. But people with smaller cars would still drive on the bike lane. So I contacted the city councilor, contacted the city. At first, the city and the city councilor were like, well, it's a matter of educating drivers and people will learn soon enough. So I did the radio version of the story, did a web story. We published the web story in the morning. We aired the radio story in the morning, and I was supposed to do a TV piece for that very same night. Early in the afternoon, I got in touch with the city of Ottawa once again, and the city indirectly admitted that there was an issue because a city representative told me, well, we are going to install some flexi posts, those little blue plastic posts next to bike lanes. So I showed up, and if you actually go and watch the TV piece or read the entire story, you will see the new blue flexi posts that were installed. So Who said that journalism can't change a thing? In this case, the intersection, in my opinion, is even safer now that drivers know better than to drive on a bike path. And here we have another example of a rather mundane meeting. It was a board meeting for the Société Transport de l'Outaouais, which is the transit agency on the Gatineau side of the river. And I went to the meeting. I don't think that anything really relevant happened. And I don't remember exactly how, but with another reporter from another outlet, we started questioning the chairman of the board regarding Twitter, because back then the STO had yet to open a Twitter account. He kept repeating, well, we aren't there yet, we're thinking about it. But a few minutes before that, he had justified a decision by saying, well, the Toronto Transit Commission, the Montreal STM, and so on are all doing that thing, so we need to do it as well. So we kind of used that argument to pressure him to give us an answer regarding Twitter. And I told him, well, about 5 minutes ago, you told us that you needed to do that thing. I don't even remember what it was, because, all of those transit agencies are doing it. Another thing that they're all doing, they're all on Twitter. And then that's how we ended up with the story. So again, mundane meeting. Does it really matter whether or not the STO is on Twitter? Well, back in 2015, it was kind of, an important question. And instead of simply attending the meeting and writing a boring story about whatever they had talked about that day, I ended up having a much more interesting story by getting the chairman of the board to admit that, they should be on Twitter. Two last examples, because so far my examples have been articles that I wrote for CBC Radio Canada. And I'm saying articles, but generally there were also TV and radio pieces. It's just much easier to share the web versions with you. So far, because I spent most of my career at CBC Radio Canada, the articles were from CBC Radio Canada, but I have two more examples. The first one from the Montreal Gazette and another one from La Presse. So I did my internship in December of 2009 at the Montreal Gazette. And one thing at the Gazette is that interns cannot be assigned to a story. So you need to come up with your own story ideas. So I did a bit of research, and then my dad told me about this guy he knew who was a recovering alcoholic, and he had opened up a booze-free lounge. So I did a story about L'Anonyme, but I didn't want the story to turn into an infomercial. So I called a few experts, and I think I ended up speaking with 2 or 3 experts who told me how valuable a place such as this one, a venue such as L'Anonyme, could be for people who were recovering either from a drug addiction or from alcoholism, because it allowed them to go out and still have a social life without being exposed to their previous addiction. So, interesting story. And the last one, Esclaves des temps modernes, was published in La Presse in April of 2005, so over 15 years ago. It's a story I'm still very proud of. I was in Benin with Canada World Youth, and with a colleague of mine, we ended up approaching Oxfam. We didn't have much to do in our actual internship, so we approached Oxfam, and Oxfam Quebec has offices in Benin, and we were put in touch with a group of women. The organization is called SOV, trying to fight against child trafficking, which is still a big issue in Benin, especially internal child trafficking. So it's called Vidomégon, and poor families from the country send their kids to the city where they believe that their kids will be looked after by, relatives and whatnot, but oftentimes the kids will end up working in markets. I'm oversimplifying the issue here, but the key is that for those of you who are interested in foreign reporting, getting in touch with NGOs can be a very good way of finding story ideas. Again, You are the journalist. It is your job to decide what is worthy of being covered, but NGOs can be invaluable when it gets to when it comes to getting in touch with local stakeholders. So that was pretty much it for my very short, very brief overview of sources that you may want to look into in order to find story ideas. Now it's your turn to do so. Do your best to find a very interesting local story for your upcoming first assignment.